people to try and make us get scared. Yes. Do not get scared. No. I didn't know what I was going to say today, but I can see everyone here. Yeah. And I'm empowered. Yes. Who's experienced racism here? Put your hands up. Who's experienced racism here? Put your hands up.
Yes, Dave. Go for it, mate.
No more. It can't let it happen no more. No. It's been televised. It's been televised. How fucking dare they?
How fucking dare they?
We can't watch it happen anymore. No.
Yes,
we can't
Dave.
stand by. No. Look at this system we're in.
Fuck the
For
system.
these people, to pit you against you, to make you hate you, to make you wear this necklace and she wants some more stress. Work together.
Fantastic, but one of my favourites is the ones that say the UK is not innocent. Because this isn't just about George Floyd, who was murdered by the police and the capitalist system in the US. The UK is not innocent because the same issues, the same racist policies, the same anti-working class policies, the same capitalist policies are done by Boris Johnson and the Tory government here. Thousands of people have died of coronavirus in the last few weeks. The government go on TV every night and lie about the numbers, lie about how many died in hospitals, lie about how many died in care homes. And one of the worst stats is how more likely black, Asian and minority ethnic people are to die of coronavirus. Now Boris Johnson wants to say that's just down to ethnicity, and there's nothing we can do about that. That is absolute bullshit. That is absolute rubbish. Look at why that is happening. Black and Asian people are more likely to be working during coronavirus. They're more likely to be on low pay. They're more likely to be in rubbish housing. These are the real reasons that people are dying of coronavirus. If you're Prince Charles or Boris Johnson or Dominic Cummings, you could drive hundreds of miles away. The police aren't going to do anything. You're going to be safe. But if you're a working class person in London, you have to keep working for the NHS. You have to keep driving buses. You have to be overcrowded accommodation where there's no social distancing on your home, there's no spare bathroom or any of this rubbish. It's working class people that have been killed by coronavirus. It's a natural disease, but it's a pandemic because of capitalism. And for that reason, if there isn't any other, we need to get rid of capitalism, put the working class in charge, get rid of people like Boris Johnson. The working class is how we run society. So everybody can be safe from police violence and safe from the capitalist policies that mean that we die younger and in poverty. Thank you.
We need to stop this racism. We need to organise. First of all, RIP to all those who lost their lives in Grenfell. So many lives were lost in Grenfell Town, but the government don't care. They didn't care about the migrants, about the black people in those council houses. They didn't care about them. That cladding was a symptom of gentrification. It was a symptom of gentrification, and the cladding was a symptom of capitalism. We need social housing policies that fix the injustice in our housing. We need justice for Grenfell. We need Labour councils to fix up and to put funding into social housing for all of us, so that the tragedy of Grenfell doesn't happen again. We need racial justice, social policies. We need rent control and to end gentrification. For the Windrush generation, we need socialist change. For the victims of Grenfell, we need social change. For justice, for Stephen Lawrence and other black people that have been murdered, we need social change. And for all the victims of police brutality, we need change. take the mic and you can come up and say your words, say what you need to say. I'm going to finish on these final words from Fred Hampton, leader of the Black Panther Party. He said, we're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight it with solidarity. We're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. We must organise solidarity and rest in power all the people.
The man.
We want justice, we want peace. We want justice, we want peace. We want justice, we want peace. We want justice, we want peace.
That this is a massive protest that is taking place against anger, against police brutality, against racism. Seriously, we're on the 21st century and we are seeing black, Asian, ethnic minorities being killed on the streets by these racist, brutal, repressive states and the police. And we say we want an immediate end to all police brutality. But the question is, how do we do it? We think today has been amazing. We took part on the protest on Sunday as well, and it has been fantastic to see so many people out here angry, annoyed, frustrated with not just the US state and the police there, but also here as well. Boris Johnson is no friend of ours. Donald Trump is no friend of ours. We need to get rid of all of them and every single one of them. And I am standing here really angry and frustrated with all of them. And I think we need to build a massive movement together, united to fight against racism. Because we, of all colour, are united together as working class people. It is the rich that is getting away with these murders. It is those police brutal officers that are getting away with murders, and we think we all need to come together to fight for a better society, and we would say that society is a socialist society.
Okay, good afternoon. Today is the 5th of June. We are here recording our first Facebook broadcast following the huge protests that have started taking place across the country in Britain following the horrific racist murder by a policeman of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, in the US. And in the last few days, we have seen eruptions of anger and a mood for change, a mood to fight for change, expressed in protests of young people across Britain. The Socialist Party has had the privilege to participate and support protests in London, in Coventry, in Birmingham, in Northampton, Southampton, Wolverhampton, Hull, Bradford. Our sister parties have been involved in protests in Vienna, Belfast, Dublin, Berlin, and many other places. And of course, our sister comrades are participating in the protests in the US. So in a few moments, we're going to have a weekly interview. But before that, I'm going to ask you to do what we always ask you to do, is if you're watching this, please share it now, because we're going to be discussing how we're going to build this movement to smash racism and to fight for the change that we need, and to help young people build a movement to fight for their future. So please share the link to this video. Please post the names of people you think should watch it, should participate in the discussion in the comments boxes below. Please get involved. Please contact us, info@socialistparty.org.uk, or go to the website socialistparty.org.uk, where you can see what we're writing, what we're saying about all of this and the need to fight for a future and more. And you can also find our contact details there. So without further ado, I will go to our interviewee this week, who is Hugo Pierre. Many of you may have seen Hugo on our previous Facebook Live events. Hugo is the Black members rep on the Unison National Executive. Unison is the biggest public sector union. He's here in a personal capacity in that way. But Hugo is also a member of the Socialist Party's National Committee. He's a leading member of our party. So we're really pleased to have Hugo here with us today. He's also an organizer in school, so he's extremely busy. But we thought it was really important that we started this discussion on these issues, and you'll have seen already in this video that we've got some footage of some of the things that we've been saying and raising, and trying to start a dialogue on these demonstrations, and this broadcast is part of that as well. So I'm going to start to ask Hugo some questions. Ask the first question and then I'll unmute you, Hugo, so just bear with me. So I think we just want to start off with, why now? This is not the first, unfortunately, murder of an unarmed black man by police in the US or anywhere in the world, but this movement has been triggered all across the world. Why has it emerged in this way now? So let me just unmute you and then see if get you to, oh, it's saying I have to unmute you, ask to unmute. Okay.
All right, well, thanks very much, Sarah, for asking me to come along, and it's a privilege actually to be able to come along and speak on one of the Socialist Party's weekly live events, because we really do need to get out there and explain why these events are taking place. Now, in some respects, just the act in itself of what we saw in that video footage, I think, was enough to cause an explosion. Certainly in the place where it actually happened in Minnesota, you'd have thought definitely people would have been out on the streets and that, and it does regularly happen that people come out in the streets. But I suppose what has made this a much bigger event, what's made it an international event, I think, is some of the things that, hopefully I can try and give some answers to in that question. We've seen over the years as well, explosions take place around this, and we shouldn't forget, yes, we've got Trump in power in the US at the moment, but we shouldn't forget that some of the biggest protests took place, and in fact the Black Lives Matter hashtag was developed under the presidency of Barack Obama, because he failed to deal with the institutional racism. There was enormous hope that was invested in his presidency, especially around his slogans that change was needed in the US, change in all of the social circumstances that led to some of the horrific conditions that people live in the US, and he failed to deliver. He failed to draw the conclusions or build a movement as how you could actually bring about that change. And so during that time we saw the murder of Trayvon Martin, police being acquitted, Michael Brown, police being acquitted, Sandra Brown, police being, there's any number of names that we can reel off, unfortunately, of people who'd been brutally murdered by the police, and absolutely nothing happened to them. And even under Barack Obama, we have to say that he instituted a review of police practices, etc., etc., etc. They went largely unimplemented, even down to the simple thing of wearing body cameras. He never brought in any legislation that meant that had to be US-wide, which would have at least given people some evidence and footage when they wanted to fight for justice for people that they had lost at the hands of police brutality. So, we've seen complete failure of the US state in one respect to act, a failure to act on the side of the ordinary person and still protecting the rich and the multinationals at the same time. So there's been mounting video evidence, and I think you can probably say, well, this was the final straw when you saw literally that couple just actually kneeling on somebody's necks for 9 minutes to brutally murder him. We saw the the harrowing video footage of that, and I think that really explained partly why everyone's up in arms in it and the failure to act in the past. But I think also, we're going through this coronavirus pandemic. It's an international event, unfortunately, and we have seen, particularly in the US, the horrific number of avoidable deaths that have taken place in that country, the largest number of deaths in the world, a president that in reality has refused to act in the interests of ordinary people, constantly talks about opening up big business. We've got to get back to business. We've got to make sure that our industry is up and running, not by the way, the crocodile tears that he sheds for ordinary workers who are losing their job, but so that companies can make profits again. That's what he's really interested in, that they don't lose out in the global scramble for profits with the likes of China and other countries around the world. So that's been his position. We've seen that as a background. So that's been a horrific background in the US, but perhaps what's made it even more horrific is that in many of the cities of the US, who have been the main people that have suffered as a result of that pandemic? And it's largely been black workers. And why? It's not because black people are genetically inferior to white people. It's because the conditions that they live in are fundamentally flawed. They live they've increased risk of living in poverty, increased risk of living in households with very, very low incomes, increased numbers of people who not just have one job in a frontline services, but often have 2 or 3 jobs as frontline workers, still having to go out and deliver various services. And so that endemic poverty in black communities has contributed substantially to the fact that they are at increased risk of death and serious illness following, having caught this disease as a result of that. And of course, there's no protection from the state. Just as in this country where there's a lack of PPE, where there's a lack of testing, where there's any protection for black workers on the front line or black workers in their homes, it's the same situation in the States, the same disgraceful situations where private companies, again, are responsible for delivering PPE, responsible for delivering testing, and have singularly failed to live up to the task. And, this coronavirus pandemic has really shown a huge spotlight on every single flaw that capitalism, whether in one country or internationally, has left the state of infrastructure in, and the ability to deliver healthcare. Again, black workers less likely to have healthcare plans, so that they're most likely not to be able to get hospital treatment, a whole range of things. I could go on the list. And I think that background has also helped to really fan the flames of the movement that's exploded over this period. And I think I think around the world, obviously, workers are expressing their solidarity with the movement, and they want to know, well, what can be done now? What can be done next? So I think the failure of past movements is also clearly in people's minds. What do we do now?
I would completely agree with what you've described there. It is an incredible coming together of all those brutal realities of capitalism, like you've described. And I think you've just led on really to the next question I wanted to ask, because it is a question that's on the lips of the youth that we've been able to discuss with on the protest so far. What they want to build a movement. They're very conscious that this is not the first movement, and the idea of gathering from previous experience some lessons and ideas, not to tell them what to do, but to have a discussion about what kind of movement needs to be built. So I was going to ask you, what would you say on that front? What kind of movement do we need now to deal with these multiple factors that you've just described?
Well, again, yes. I mean, I think that is a really, really important question. As I said, during the sort of 2010s, the teens, 20 teens, whatever they're called, during that particular period of time, we did see the development of the Black Lives Matter, or the hashtag, and a movement around it. And I think it's important to state that that movement, in a sense, tried to become a break from what happened in the past, particularly in the US. In the US, the gains in effect of the civil rights movement that took place in the 1960s resulted in a layer of blacks becoming middle class, a layer of blacks being able to get to not the top table, well actually in the case of Barack Obama they did get to the top table, but a thin layer of blacks being able to make their way up the greasy pole in a sense in capitalist society. So, you know, you've got the likes of Oprah Winfrey and various other people who, you know, can be held up, I suppose, as role models, as it were. But what did that fundamentally change on the ground? Absolutely nothing. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement, in a sense, reflected the fact that the Democratic Party, which is a party of big business, it's not a workers' party, it's a party of big business in the US. The Democratic Party had really shored up, managed to corral all of that sort of layer of blacks into its ranks. And we've seen in the US, you know, black youth can see what's the result of that. So yes, there are black mayors, there are black police chiefs even. You know, there are constantly, there are black people playing a leading role in some areas of society, but still nothing has changed on the ground. Absolutely nothing. You know, the levels of poverty have increased, the levels of foreclosures on mortgages has increased, the level of people being thrown out of work has increased, especially in the in the period post the stock market crash in 2007-8. So a lot of young people, I think, drew incorrectly, and that is something I would say to young people today. You know, look at the evidence, but a lot of young people drew incorrectly that we didn't need another party. We didn't need a party that was going to, you know, be, in a sense, I think they were thinking of it as being authoritarian, but let's face it, particularly in the States, they'd have seen all of the shenanigans that were going on, people with their fingers in the pie, corruption, all sorts of stuff, and not being representatives of the people, not fighting for local working class people. They would have drawn the conclusion that actually we don't need to get into that anymore. That's all abhorrent. We're disgusted by these people. They don't represent us. And actually that even includes previous people who put themselves forward as big civil rights leaders, people like Al Sharpton, you know, who was seen to be protecting their own private interests around their media empire, etc., rather than challenging the fundamental existence of racism in the States and the fundamental existence of capitalism that feeds onto it. So, you know, I think a lot of young people unfortunately drew the conclusions. I suppose, you know, you can only draw the lessons of what's there in front of your face, and decided that the Black Lives Matter movement, it wouldn't be a structured, consistent campaign, but it was going to be a hashtag, a vague movement. You know, if you look at the demands of the movement, they're very inclusive, and they're an attempt to bring people in and draw people in and allow all different opinions to be voiced within that movement. But what are they demanding? What are the things that they're concretely demanding and concretely proposing? Well, there's actually very, very little if you look at the founding statement of Black Lives Matter, what they're actually demanding. Of course, if you look at some of the position papers they have and all the rest of it, you know, you can see a little bit more, but it's not rounded out. It's not really a tool that you can really use to challenge racism successfully in the US. So I think it's been a useful banner for mobilizing young people. Don't get me wrong. And, you know, young people have come under that banner even in this country as well, and around the world as well. It's a very much a useful tool. But I suppose we've got to pose the question, how are we going to seriously defeat racism? What are we going to do to take that on? And I think that in order to do that, you've got to start with an analysis of what racism is. You've absolutely got to understand, why does it exist in today's society? And for us, that's got to be the starting point. What's your analysis? And I think our analysis in the Socialist Party is absolutely clear. That racism is at root a product of class society. At root, it's a divide and rule tactic that's used by the ruling class to ensure that those people that create the wealth for the ruling class don't come together to be able to take that wealth off of the ruling class, and that that racism actually was one of the founding parts of capitalism, especially in the US, where slavery was used to build the wealth that that many of the big families that own most of the US economy, where they got their wealth from. It was fundamentally from slavery at that point in time. And so, we start with that as our analysis of it. And of course, we then draw the conclusion, well, who is going to be the people that could eventually defeat racism and defeat capitalism as a system? So if capitalism depends on exploiting working class people, then the people that have got the potential power to unite and overthrow capitalism are the working class. So we start with an analysis, and then an organization then has to develop a program that brings people together to fight for, to the end, to see that mission through. That can only be done through some form of a party that brings the masses of people together. So we think then it's really important that in the US, in this country as well, that a workers' movement, a mass workers' movement is built. And yes, anti-racism has to be at its absolute core. And the young people that are out there today, if you're not in a union, but you're out there protesting, or you're in a student union, or even in your local communities, get people together first. Let's build a proper movement. Let people join something, and then have those debates and the discussions in that movement at how we can go forward, and listen to the ideas that socialists put forward, because they've got a long experience of fighting racism. And as I say, this key question of the role of the working class. How does the working class organize? The working class organizes. Yes, there are many forms, but the most fundamental one is trade unions. We organize in trade unions so that we can fight for our daily demands, like better housing, like better pay at work, health and safety at work. We fight for a whole range of things at work, but also broader things in the community as well. And so making sure that our trade unions, which aren't always fantastic, I will be the first to say that, they're not always fantastic, but we have to fight for our trade unions to be better, that they have better leaders, that they have better policies, and that they're more determined to do that. These aren't easy solutions that I'm giving you, but this is all part of the struggle that we need to be involved in. And so, of course, the question of attacking discrimination at work, look at the health workers that have died as a result of this coronavirus in this country. And the NHS has been proven, there are reports on this over time that say that the NHS has failed to, failed to listen to the voices, failed to take up the grievances of black workers. And so it's no wonder that black workers are at the forefront of this. So yes, I think a new powerful movement has to be built on democratic principles, with structure, so that with a program that means that we can start to develop a mass solution to this problem, that with the working class at the very heart of it.
Yeah, again, unsurprisingly, we're both in the Socialist Party. I would agree with what Hugo said there. And I think, actually, at this moment in time, one of the things that's more clear maybe than it has been for a while is the role of the trade unions, isn't it? In London, towards the end of the protest, I was standing beside a bus stop, and a bus pulled in, and at the middle doors, people watching who don't know about London buses, you can enter at the front or beside the driver, or you can enter in the middle of the bus. And London buses at the moment say you have to enter in the middle. And that's because, very sadly and horrendously, bus drivers in London have died at a faster rate from the COVID-19 than any other group of workers or any other group in society, actually. A very mixed workforce, you know, in terms of, you know, race and ethnicity and so on. But those drivers have not stood by. They, first of all, campaigned to stop people sitting in the front areas to try and reduce the viral load and, you know, keep themselves a bit safer. The bus company bosses, unbelievably, threatened disciplinary action for workers organising that kind of safety action, but the drivers did not give up. In their thousands, they were organising democratically what their demands were, and they raised very strongly the demand to shut the front doors to keep the workforce safe, collective action for workplace safety, which really, I think, shows and they won that, and that shows the power, doesn't it, of the trade unions today. And we could spread that out through education and through all other sectors, that we can't trust the bosses with our safety. We can't trust the bosses with workplaces being run in a fair way. But workers, when they're organised, have got power, including rotas to keep more vulnerable workers safe, or sharing out the load and so on. You know, so that we're seeing, but organised on a kind of, you know, by workers, not by the bosses helping at all, in fact, against the bosses. So I completely agree with what you say. Now, I've got a poster behind me that everyone will recognise, Malcolm X. But the next question I wanted to ask was really going back to the civil rights movement. In the USA, it's being said now that these are the biggest protests since the assassination of Martin Luther King. And that obviously is a period that looms really huge for anyone wanting to think about how do we fight racism. And it was incredible movement, wasn't it? It was powerful, it was far going, it started to reach out to involve lots of different sections of society. And yet it didn't achieve everything that it set out to do. But nonetheless, there are lessons, huge lessons for us today from it. And I know you've written about this and you've thought about this a lot. So I wanted to ask you that next. What are the lessons of that 1960s civil rights movement for building a movement today?
Well, as you say, Sarah, there are huge lessons from that movement, you know, and in a sense, some of them hark back to what I just, you know, the answers I gave to the previous question, because there we did see a very disciplined and organised mass movement develop particularly in the southern states. I would even go as far to say that in the southern states during that period of the 1960s, late 1950s, right through to the 1960s, that there was, I think, what we would describe as an insurrectionary mood in those southern states. That's where effectively the power of the state held little sway, particularly amongst the black community, but it did go wider than that in the southern states. And it meant that, you know, because people were involved in a huge protest movement, and it was an organised, disciplined protest movement with aims and objectives. And actually those aims and objectives developed through the course of those struggles. And that's why it's so important for young people, particularly involved in this movement now, to look at the lessons of that period of time. And of course, it appeared on the surface that that movement came out of the churches, particularly out of the Baptist, the church, and that Martin Luther King. It was all very much a Christian movement that developed, actually nothing could be further from the truth. People who were involved in that from the very beginning were trade unionists, black trade unionists in particular, who'd gone through the period of the war with a whole number of trade union struggles, some very famous trade union struggles that were very successful during that period of time. You know, they went through that period, weren't prepared to put up with the situation post-war, and were involved from the very beginning in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. It even included communists and communist sympathizers. Rosa Parks, for example, had a lot of sympathy with the Communist Party. Not quite sure whether she was actually a member or not. Still a lot of controversy around that. But you know, there were people who were actively involved in the socialist movement, the broader socialist movement, perhaps not in exactly the way that we would see it, but the broader socialist movement at that time, who were involved from the very, very beginning of that movement. And it unleashed, as I say, a huge period of civil disobedience that took place. Yes, based on Martin Luther King's principles, it started off as a non-violent movement, or certainly a non-violent movement from the point of view of the protesters. And so we saw this civil disobedience campaign. We saw the whole thing about the bus boycotts started in Montgomery, but spread further throughout the whole states. The whole thing about lunch counters, the sit-ins, the huge campaigns that took place around voter registration, which again showed that they'd drawn the lesson, that it wasn't just enough to protest, but actually you had to change the political establishment in the areas that you lived if you wanted to see far-reaching change. And let's tackle this thing about non-violence, actually, because we then also saw the states meting out huge amounts of brutality on protesters, and we saw paramilitary far-right organizations like the Ku Klux Klan burning down churches, which involved the murder of 12 young people in a church at one stage. You know, we saw the huge brutality of that movement on the state, which really opened the eyes of particularly American youth to the brutality of what was going on in the southern states. But actually that movement also had to learn the question of self-defense. And if it wasn't immediately apparent to those people around Martin Luther King, in wider circles in other parts of America, many people were learning the lessons that if we're going to protest, if we're going to be serious about taking on the state in America, we need to learn the lessons around self-defense and even armed self-defense in the States. And so it put that out there for people to see. So whilst non-violence may have been a core of the movement in the South, the lessons about the requirement for self-defense were out there. But let's look at what they then achieved with this disciplined movement. So they achieved the ending of Jim Crow. They desegregated whole sections of society. In fact, in many of those areas where blacks had been completely excluded from political life, we now see in many of those areas they've got, black people in the political leadership of many of those areas of the South. So it did forced America to have equal rights legislation, and so many gains came out of that mass movement that took place. But as I say, it was organization, it was discipline. And I think we need to also, what impact did it have on the leaders themselves? What impact did it have on Martin Luther King, for example? Because I think, again, he started out as a well-meaning but determined Christian leader. But was he the same person when just before he was assassinated? Absolutely not. I'm paraphrasing him here, but he basically was saying, what use is freedom if you haven't got the money in your pocket to go and sit at the lunch counter that you've just fought for desegregation for? He started to draw the lessons that there was social inequality in the US that had to be tackled, and that a new social system needed to replace what was existing in society at that moment in time. Now, I'm not going to say he fully drew out the need for socialism, but he was definitely on the way to exposing the fact that capitalism couldn't meet the needs of ordinary people, particularly working class people. And in drawing those conclusions, he then acted on it. So where did Martin Luther King then go? Yes, he went to the trade unions. He was involved in many protests and strikes of workers who were fighting for decent pay, in some cases fighting for equal pay, but fighting for decent pay. It was, you know, his murder eventually took place as he was preparing to support sanitation workers in a huge strike protest that they were organising the following day. And he started to link up with white workers as well. So, you know, that question of knowing where the power lies to change this situation was key in his mind. So it's absolutely critical that we learn some of those lessons from that huge movement that took place in the 1960s.
Bear with us, we haven't got the technical team that we normally do because everyone's busy getting ready for the weekend's protest, so it's down to me, and I'm not very good at this. But yeah, I think that's you know, really good points that you've made, and it's especially important, isn't it, that the young people protesting today look at some of these aspects of the civil rights movement, because young people are literally facing a fight for their future now, aren't they? I mean, they're estimating 1 million young people unemployed by Christmas. There's a huge crisis in higher education. You know, access to getting a degree is, you know, really under threat by the capitalist class, really, who are going to be demanding that young people pay for all the spending that they've done during this pandemic crisis, that young people pay the price for that, and that the bosses carry on making profits. And so the question of workplace organisation, young people, you know, joining a union and then fighting for those unions to be fighting organisations is so urgent now, isn't it? And, you know, in the Socialist Party, we have got a lot of members like Hugo who are involved in the unions, but in that struggle for a programme that stands for all workers, against, you know, we don't accept that any worker should lose their job or lose their pay. In fact, we fight for £12 an hour minimum wage immediately, £15 in London, because that's what's necessary, isn't it? Why should we not have what is necessary? And that's what, you know, Hugo's saying about what the strikes and so on that Martin Luther King was involved in. And so, you know, if you're interested in discussing some of these things, we don't have time to go into it all today, but those are the things that we will be discussing in our Zoom meetings. Those are the things that we are fighting for on a day-to-day basis all across the country and with our sister parties internationally. So I just had one more question, Hugo, which really you have led us on to already, and is obviously written up behind me, which is the famous, well, we think it should be the most famous quote really from Malcolm X, shouldn't it? The conclusion that he drew, that you started with really in explaining where racism actually comes from, that you cannot have capitalism without racism. But obviously saying that is really important, understanding that is really important, but what does it mean we have to do? Where do we take that idea in the fight? So
yeah. Well, again, thanks for that, Sarah. You know, I think it's, you know, that movement that took place in the South really inspired a lot of blacks who had migrated, or whose families had migrated earlier on into the northern cities for work. But they faced a different form of struggle in some ways. And so the big protests against desegregation, they didn't face those in the North in the same way. Racism had a different face for them. And that face for them was mass unemployment, was poverty housing conditions, and specifically was police brutality in those big cities. And so Malcolm, in a sense, was a product of a different form of racism that was taking place in the North. And so that question of non-violent protests wasn't an open option for you know, blacks in the North in particular. And Malcolm drew those lessons quite quickly. But, you know, you've got the famous saying behind you, but I think it's probably quite important to say how, you know, because Malcolm drew that conclusion. Why did he draw that conclusion? Because he started off in the Nation of Islam, you know, and his political activity. But he drew, through his experience in that organization, that black capitalism was not a way forward. And that's what the Nation of Islam was. It became, really as a result of his work and activity, became a huge organization. It became an empire, with wealth, with property, with a whole range of things. And actually, that wasn't what Malcolm was interested in. Elijah Muhammad, the leader, was, but Malcolm wasn't interested in that. Malcolm was interested in fundamental change in society. And so when his ideas came up against the need for fundamental change in society and came up against the restrictions of black capitalism itself, he broke with it. He broke with black capitalism, and in his tour around the world that then later, well, particularly in the Middle East, but in his tour that took place then, he also noticed that in discussions with many leaders, that where there'd been a break or an attempt to break with capitalism, that the levels of racism in those societies was much less present. And we would call that attempt to break with capitalism in the colonial revolution. And I'd ask you to look at our site and look at what we say about that. I haven't got time to really go into that at this stage, but it was an important stage era of world history for us to go through. But Malcolm went through that period where one set of imperial rulers was being overthrown after another, particularly in Africa and other parts of the world. And he decided that he was going to attempt to build a movement after he left the nation that was actually also going to collaborate with white workers' organizations, an organization that, yes, it was a black organization, but wasn't going to fight white racism with black racism or white capitalism with black capitalism, but a movement that was going to try and break down the barriers of racism. And it was obviously during the course of that struggle that he realized that you can't have capitalism without racism. And actually, he also turned to workers' struggles to help assist and develop workers' struggles, particularly where he was based in New York. And he saw the key aims and objectives that workers had in their interests. And so how do we put that slogan, how do we develop that slogan into a slogan that really means something for today's young people? And I would stress to all the young people listening to that, look, you guys don't have to go through 10, 20 years of hard knocks to come to the conclusions that we're helping to draw out here. You know, if this is your first time listening to one of these podcasts from us, really come and discuss with us. Come and have an idea about what we're saying. Come and join with us. We're now obviously having a lot of branch meetings, local meetings, regional meetings, whatever, online at the moment. So it's even easier now to get involved with one of our meetings. In one respect, we don't think it's the ideal way of going ahead, by the way, but let's take this opportunity, come to our meetings, discuss with us, discuss why we think that building a socialist society, the fight for a socialist society, is going to be the key thing that you can do in the battle to end racism. You know, because we think that the trade unions obviously play a key role. It may not have seemed like they play a key role. Many of you won't have known anything particularly that a trade union has done. If you're in your 20s, then possibly you may well have had your mum and dad go off to a demonstration in 2011 where there were 750,000 trade unionists on the street, and that may have passed you by to an extent. You may even have noticed that in the November of that year rather, that there were 2 million trade unionists on strike against the austerity of the liberal Tory. Sorry, I think I just had a phone call because I'm doing this on my phone. I just had a phone call and I've just closed them off. So I hope they don't come again. Anyway, you may well also have noticed that, but you know, largely probably a lot of things have passed you by. And that's because our trade union leaders have failed, with a few exceptions, have failed to live up to the task that has faced them during the austerity years. So the trade unions, but that doesn't mean that the potential power of workers, as was seen, by the way, in those 2011 demonstrations and strike action, where things were closed down and the whole state was ranged against those movements, doesn't mean that that potential power that exists to fundamentally change society, to take over society, to run it in the interests of working people democratically, so that we decide where all those resources that we make, don't be fooled into thinking that some entrepreneur on Dragon's Den has sat down and loaned out all this money so that somebody else can come up with a fantastic idea that makes them really wealthy. The people that will make them wealthy are the people that are working day to day on any of those ideas that come out. You know, look at what's happened just recently with this coronavirus scandal. How many hedge fund owners are people missing at this particular moment in time? You know, how many stockbrokers are people missing at this particular moment in time? None of them. None of them are important. Bankers, none of them are important. Who are the important people in society? You know, draw those conclusions. Yes, it's cleaners. It's hospital workers, health workers, doctors, nurses. It's local authority workers who are providing social services and schools for critical workers. All of those people, shop workers, bus workers, transport workers, railway workers, you know, all of those people who keep society ticking over. All of those people are the people who are the fundamental backbone of society. And of course, we would put into that, and of course, many workers who work in manufacturing and industry probably have been furloughed. But why the bosses are desperate for them to come back? Because the bosses aren't making any profit without those people working. They're absolutely desperate for it to come back. So why should we leave the money in their hands? We need to take over that money. So we need to make sure that our trade unions are fighting. They're fighting for, as Sarah said, £12 an hour, £15 an hour in London. They're fighting for a 35-hour week and even a 4-day week for workers, so that the work can be shared out. They're fighting for the resources to make sure that houses can be built for not just the homeless, but decent houses can be built for ordinary working class people to be living, and that we have a plan as a socialist movement for delivering that. We're fighting to make sure that transport, for example, is cheap, is green, is publicly owned, and publicly controlled by the workers' movement, so that that transport can, you know, it would have been relatively easy under a socialist society to ensure that public transport continued and was safe and was able to deliver workers to their work, even under the conditions of this pandemic, if we use the ingenuity of ordinary working class people to make sure that it was safe, so that people didn't have to come, particularly in London, where I'm based. And I've seen the absolutely amazing clean air over the lockdown period, which I think many of us have experienced and don't want to go back to the filthy smog that we live in. But rather than people having to travel individually on private transport in their own cars, we could have seen workers' ingenuity transforming public service so that it would be completely safe during this pandemic period. But instead, we've seen the farce that's taken place with the Mayor Sadiq Khan, first of all, closing down public transport down to minimal levels, and a whole range of things, giving in to Boris Johnson's demands about increasing fares. And we've seen all of that farce. So yes, we have to be crucially involved. And in the Socialist Party, we believe fundamentally we need to have a democratic movement, but we need to then decide what we do based on the principles, as I say, of how we see society runs. And then we need to act in a tightly coordinated way, a determined way, to see those demands through and help to organise the wider movement. We don't believe on our own that we can do it, but we think we are a powerful lever for the whole working class movement to come together. And we believe that could be done actually fairly simply. Look at the shambles now that the Labour Party's in with Keir Starmer, who's acting in his own personal interest to become the next Prime Minister, to not really speak up for workers, who are to call for the premature ending of lockdown without any safety measures, and then not acting in workers' interests. We've seen that shambles now in the Labour Party, and we're also starting to see, by the way, the beginnings of a move to rid that whole layer of people who came into the Labour Party to back the socialist aims of Jeremy Corbyn. We're seeing the beginnings of trying to rid the Labour Party of all of those people that joined with the good intentions of backing Jeremy Corbyn. We're seeing them slowly starting to get rid of them. So we're seeing that taking place. We believe that it's really vitally important we use our powers to develop a workers' movement, a workers' party, to develop a new way forward for working class people coming together on a mass basis, so that we can use that to completely transform society, get rid of that parasitical ruling class that's the big monkey on our backs, and transform society into a society where we control the wealth, where we plan how that wealth is spent in the interest of ordinary working class people.
Hear, hear to that. That's what I can say. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hugo. And that's it from us for today. If you are interested, like Hugo said, there's so many topics that we were only able to touch on, and probably we could have gone on all day, couldn't we, Hugo, and thinking,
Yes.
discussing these questions, because there's so much. But please come to a Socialist Party Zoom meeting. If you go on the website, there's a link where you can fill in a form, send us your email, your phone number, and we will send you the details of meetings in your area. And it's important that we're organising in areas, even though it's online, but I'm in the Waltham Forest branch, Hugo's in the East London branch, because that's where struggles are taking place, isn't it? And so we're not an online party, like Hugo has been describing. We are a party of fighters for socialist change. And so we're organised to be able to support workers and young people in our areas fighting back, obviously linking up on the big London demos and the big citywide demos and so on. But we are building an organised body of fighters, like Hugo described, in our areas, and we want you to be part of it. Obviously not just in those 2 areas that I mentioned, but in dozens and dozens of places across the country and across the world. So please get in touch and join us. Be part of this fight for socialist change, because everything that's happening at the moment shows that it is urgent. We want this movement that is being born to grow into something, a movement that can win. So get in touch, get involved, and hopefully see you not next week on Friday on Facebook, but in the next couple of days on the protests that are taking place around the country, and in the Zoom meetings next week, and back here 1 o'clock next Friday. Thanks very much for watching today, and let's build this movement.